Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, October 31st. And we begin tonight in Ontario, where the Education Minister introduced back-to-work legislation today. The move is to avert a possible strike by support staff this week. Stephen Lecce says the forced contract will be put in place because the government is unyielding in its commitment to keep kids in the classroom. He says this is in response to a refusal by the Canadian Union of Public Employees to withdraw their intent to strike. Now, in response, CUPE has announced that its approximately 55,000 education workers will stage a province-wide walkout on Friday. A nationwide survey suggests Canadians are struggling to provide food for themselves and their families. The majority of respondents to a Canadian Hub for Applied and Social Research survey report that they're using coupons or they're hunting for sales to cope with increasing food costs. Nearly 20% are also reducing meal sizes or skipping meals altogether in order to save money. In adapting to the surging food costs, 54% of survey respondents said they made meal budget plans to ensure they had enough money for food. Well, as public criticism piles on the Bank of Canada, Governor Tiff Macklem says he feels no threat to the institution's independence. In an interview with the Canadian Press, the governor said the bank has been facing some tough questions, but he hasn't felt a threat to its independence. Over the last year, the central bank has been under intense scrutiny. Since March, the Bank of Canada has raised its key interest rate 6 times consecutively. It's embarking on one of the fastest monetary policy tightening cycles in its history. All right, turning to the nation's capital, where former Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly says he took a more direct role in the police response to the Freedom Convoy protest. He said this at an inquiry into the government's use of the Emergencies Act. Mr. Slowly says he lost some degree of trust in his deputy chiefs as the protest continued on. He's been repeatedly accused of creating confusion and dysfunction in the ranks of the Ottawa Police during the protest by not abiding by the chain of command. All right, well, meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says Canada is adding Iran's national police force and an Iranian international university to its sanctions list. The addition of Iran's law enforcement forces and Al Mustafa International University today comes as Tehran continues to crack down on weeks of dissent. In a statement, Ms. Joly accused the police force of participating in the lethal suppression and arbitrary detention of Iranian protesters. She also accused the Iranian regime of using the university, which has branches in several countries, to spread its ideology abroad and recruit foreign fighters. Tragedy in Quebec. Police say they have found the body of a 1-month-old baby missing in the waters off the northern shores of Laval. The baby boy was in a vehicle with his mother and 4-year-old sister when it plunged into a river shortly before 5 p.m. on Friday. Police say the 40-year-old woman was hospitalized and unable to speak to investigators. The 4-year-old girl was released from hospital Friday evening. Laval police confirmed the discovery of the body after a 3rd day of searching. All right, well, on the East Coast, Canada's Governor General got a first-hand view this weekend of the damage that Hurricane Fiona delivered to PEI. Mary Simon and her spouse, Whit Fraser, visited the island. She says she was heartbroken to see the loss of homes and businesses. She also recognized the harm done to local fishers, crops, and the tourist industry. Ms. Simon says the biggest impact was meeting people whose livelihoods are directly affected and whose primary job now is to rebuild. On the other side of the country, BC's outgoing premier says some of the greatest lessons that he has learned came from the people he considered to be opponents. John Horgan says he found ways to work with people of all political stripes during his time as premier. This is including former BC Green leader Andrew Weaver, former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Mr. Horgan's last official day as premier is November 18th. This is when recently acclaimed New Democrat leader David Eby will be sworn in to replace him. Back in the East, a concert to raise funds for Newfoundland residents displaced due to post-tropical storm Fiona raised $1.69 million. The show last night at Mary Brown Centre in St. John's featured the Irish Descendants, the Masterless Men, and Tim Baker. The $1.69 million comes from a combination of concert ticket sales, federal cash, and a contribution from Mary Brown's fast food chain. The fried chicken restaurant donated $335,000 in sales to the relief fund. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at more news from across Canada and around the world. Stay with us. Vigils were held in Winnipeg and Thompson, Manitoba over the weekend for 4 children whose lives were lost following a house fire. Many of those at Saturday night's vigil in Thompson brought their children and walked with them to a makeshift memorial, which was decorated with stuffed animals, candles, helium-filled balloons, and flowers. RCMP Sergeant Paul Menegra said in an email yesterday that while he did not know the cause of last week's fire, it has been determined to not be criminal in nature. He said the residents did not have any working smoke detectors. All right, well, meanwhile, Ontario's fall economic statement is set to be released on November 14th. Finance Minister Peter Bethlen-Falvey says it will provide an update on the province's, quote, plan to build. He announced last month that Ontario ended the last fiscal year with a $2.1 billion surplus. This was thanks to inflation and a strong economy. Last week, the province's financial watchdog said it projects budget surpluses for the next 5 years, but it also said the government is not being transparent about how it plans to spend money over the next several years. Well, some good news on the East Coast. A 6-year-old boy from Florida reported missing more than 2 months ago has been found safe in New Brunswick. The RCMP say the child was reported missing to the Miami-Dade Police Department on August 27th, and he was found in Moncton on the weekend. A 45-year-old man was arrested in Moncton and is in police custody, as is a 68-year-old woman. The Miami-Dade police have previously identified the 2 adults as the boy's father and paternal grandmother. The UN Labor Agency is warning that job vacancies and employment growth are expected to decline worldwide in the 4th quarter. The International Labor Organization says the war in Ukraine and multiple overlapping crises have led to inflation, declining real wages, higher debt, and yawning inequality. The 10th edition of ILO's monitoring report on the world of work was released on Monday. It says that after a rebound from a pandemic slump earlier this year, the situation has deteriorated. The number of hours of work have dropped by 1.5%, or the equivalent of a deficit of 40 million full-time jobs. Well, it looks like the U.S. Federal Reserve may reach a turning point this week as it announces what's expected to be another 3/4 point increase in its key interest rate, which is its 4th straight oversized increase. At a news conference after the Fed's latest meeting on Wednesday, Chair Jerome Powell could signal a forthcoming shift to smaller rate increases. And doing so would give officials time to assess the impact of the hikes, which are intended to cool the highest inflation in 4 decades, but are also raising the risk of a recession. The Chief Justice of Ukraine's Supreme Court says judges in the embattled country are donating 60% of their salaries to the military, and they need more financial support. The Ukrainian Chief Justice met with his Canadian counterpart this morning in Ottawa. He says the system in his home country is overwhelmed and reform is needed. As the Russian invasion continues, Canada says it will continue to offer support to Ukraine. Judges have approved a request by the International Criminal Court's prosecutor to reopen an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan. They are saying Afghan authorities are not conducting meaningful probes. The court announced the decision on Monday, which is just over a year after prosecutor Karim Khan said he wanted to resume an ICC probe in Afghanistan. This was because domestic investigations were extremely unlikely under the new Taliban rulers. Twitter's unending fight against Spambot accounts is now a problem for new owner Elon Musk, who pledged in April to defeat the bot scourge or, quote, die trying. He later cited bots as a reason to back out of buying the social platform. The bot count matters because advertisers want to know roughly how many real humans they're reaching when they buy ads. Mr. Musk says he has hired a team to begin diving into the platform's inner workings and count how many bot accounts are really active. Sounds like something right out of a movie. Researchers say that they've found the largest meteor threatening Earth in 8 years. This comes not long after NASA's mission to try and change the direction of an asteroid with its DART probe. International researchers say they've discovered three new near-Earth asteroids that have been hiding within the inner solar system. The comet's hiding spot is considered difficult to monitor given the sun's glare. The team says two of the asteroids have orbits that won't intersect with Earth, but one, a 1.5-kilometer wide asteroid, could someday cross our path. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. Up next, we'll have a look at the federal deficit and what one organization thinks should be done about it. We'll have an interview with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation up next. So stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. Stay tuned. Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland will be delivering her fall economic statement on Thursday. And she has already made it clear that there won't be a lot of money to help Canadians cope with inflation. Ms. Freeland has been pointing out lately that doing so would just further fuel inflation. Instead, she is setting the stage for an economic statement which focuses on the economy of the future. It's one that is heavily focused on clean power, electric vehicles, battery manufacturing, and critical minerals. Ahead of the budget, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation recently appeared before the House of Commons Finance Committee. Now, this was to provide their own plan for the federal budget. With us now to unpack this plan is the CTF's federal director, Franco Terrazzano. Mr. Terrazzano, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on.
So can you unpack your pre-budget submission for our viewers?
Absolutely. I mean, the most important recommendation is to bring spending back to pre-pandemic levels, which were already at all-time highs. And if the government did that, it would balance the budget next year. Now, here's why that's so important. The government was already spending all-time highs before the pandemic in 2018, which means that the Trudeau government in 2018 spent more money than the feds did during any single year during World War II, even after accounting for inflation and population growth. So with overspending like that for years, finding savings in every area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean.
And what kind of response did you get from officials regarding this submission, Mr. Terrazzano?
Well, we were there essentially to tell them that it's time to end the party with taxpayers' money. Now, they're going to hear from hundreds of individuals and groups asking them to spend more, but we were there asking them to spend less. So we were there to say no more wasting $8,800 on a sex toy show in Germany, no more racking up nearly $100,000 on fancy airplane food during a week-long trip, no more giving members of parliament pay raise after pay raise after pay raise while their constituents struggle through a pandemic, and no more giving big corporations buckets of cash, which is known as corporate welfare.
So what would a plan or this plan look like for everyday Canadians if it were to be implemented, and how would it help them fight inflation?
Well, the government, if they adopt the plan, would be able to balance the budget next year, which means that they would have room to provide tax relief and reverse the tax hikes, which are harming so many Canadians, which are making it more expensive to fuel up your car with gas or put ground beef in your grocery cart. Look, it should have been a no-brainer that at the very least, the federal government not raise taxes during the pandemic when people were losing their jobs, losing their business, or taking pay cuts. But unfortunately, we saw the federal government raise the carbon tax, raise alcohol taxes, and take more money from workers through payroll tax hikes.
Now, we mentioned that Ms. Freeland has warned that Canadians cannot be supported the way we were during the height of the pandemic. She said it would fuel inflation. So how would going back to pre-pandemic spending impact inflation?
Well, we need to see the government reduce its spending. Spending more money on everything forever is not sustainable, and that's what's driving inflation. I mean, we saw the government overspending for years. Then during the pandemic, the Bank of Canada printed $300 billion right out of thin air, largely by buying Government of Canada debt. That is the inflation tax. And of course, the cherry on top, which is driving inflation, are the inflationary tax hikes, like the gas tax hikes, like the taxes that are increasing alcohol every time you go to pick up that 2-4 or the bottle of Pinot Noir. So what our plan would allow the government to do would be able to reduce its spending and lower taxes.
Now, on the other hand, amid inflation and climbing interest rates, is it realistic for the government to consider cutting spending, which might impact social services that people are relying on, Mr. Terrazzano?
Well, all we're saying is bring spending back to pre-pandemic levels of 2018-19, which were already all-time highs. I mean, if you can remember back to 2018, nobody was calling that budget austerity. This is very realistic, and the government could balance its budget next year just by bringing spending back to the pre-pandemic levels. But look, there's a ton of government spending that needs to be trimmed. Remember, the federal government gave 300,000 bureaucrats a pay raise during the middle of the pandemic when their neighbors in the private sector lost their job, took cuts, or lost their business. And that's not fair. Let's also not forget that the government is giving failing crown corporations like the Bank of Canada, like the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporations, bonuses during the middle of the pandemic. And also, the government doesn't need to be announcing $295 million for the Ford Motor Company or more than $300 million for Bombardier.
Lots to think about, Mr. Terrazzano. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.
Stay with us. After the break, we're going to have a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world. A Canadian is among the injured after a deadly crowd surge in South Korea. Over 130 people are killed after a bridge collapses in India. Saudi Arabia and the UAE defend oil production cuts, and EU inflation hits another record high in October. So stay tuned for these stories and more stories from around the world. Forum Daily will be right back after this short break. Stay with us. A Canadian was among those injured in a crowd surge that killed more than 150 people in Seoul, South Korea. Global Affairs Canada confirms that officials are in touch with local authorities to gather more information and provide consular assistance to those affected. South Korean officials say at least 153 people, mostly in their 20s and 30s, were trapped and crushed. This was after a huge Halloween party crowd surged into a narrow alley. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau joined other international leaders in offering condolences to South Korea following the deadly stampede. Meanwhile, in India, military teams are searching for people missing after a century-old pedestrian bridge collapsed into a river in a western state, killing at least 133 people. As families mourn the dead, attention is turning to the reasons for the bridge's collapse. The suspension bridge had reopened 4 days earlier after 6 months of repairs. And officials say it was overloaded with tourists drawn to the attraction during the Hindu festival season. Police have arrested 9 people as they investigate the bridge collapse. Moving to Ukraine now, where a massive barrage of Russian strikes against critical infrastructure has knocked out water and power supplies to hundreds of civilians. The attack is a retaliation for what Moscow alleged was a Ukrainian attack on its Black Sea fleet over the weekend. The mayor of Ukraine's capital said that 80% of consumers in Kyiv were left without water supplies. This is due to the damage to a power facility nearby. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are defending a decision by OPEC and its allies to cut oil production. This comes even as an American envoy warns of economic uncertainty ahead for the world. Saudi Arabia's energy minister, Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, was greeted with applause after stating, quote, "We don't owe it to anybody but us." Emirati Energy Minister Suhail al-Mazrouai echoed that defense. OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, has insisted its decision came from concerns about the global economy. All right, well, this comes as the annual inflation rate in the European Union hit another record in October at 10.7%. Now, that's the highest since stats began in 1997. Higher prices for natural gas, oil, and electricity, fueled by cutbacks from Russia over the war in Ukraine, were the major reason for the increase. The rising cost of living is dampening economic growth in the EU, which came in at 0.2% in the third quarter. Now, this with many economists saying a recession can't be far behind. To Brazil now, which has elected Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to be the next president. This comes in an election that rejects incumbent Jair Bolsonaro's far-right politics. Mr. da Silva received 50.9% of the vote, according to the country's election authority. Mr. Bolsonaro has yet to publicly concede or react in any way, even as truckers blockaded some roads across the country in protest. For Mr. da Silva, the high-stakes election is a stunning comeback after he was imprisoned for corruption in 2018 and was unable to participate in the election that year. Iranian authorities say they will hold public trials for 1,000 people in the capital, Tehran, over the protests that have convulsed the country. The mass indictments were announced on Monday. They mark the government's first major legal action aimed at quashing dissent since unrest erupted over 6 weeks ago. The nationwide protests first erupted over the September 16th death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in the custody of the country's morality police. Haiti's national police says it's been ordered to launch an investigation into the death of a journalist. Witnesses said he was struck in the head by a police tear gas canister. Police Chief France Alba said in a statement late on Sunday that officers were forced to fire tear gas to control a hostile crowd attacking a police station. Witnesses told the Associated Press that journalists, including deceased reporter Romel Sanville-Saint, had gathered at a police station in Delmas on Sunday. This was to demand the release of a colleague detained while covering a protest. Witnesses also said police had fired on the journalists using live rounds. China has launched the third and final module to complete its permanent low-orbit space station. The decade-long effort to maintain a constant crewed presence in orbit takes another step. This comes as the competition between China and the U.S. grows increasingly fierce. The crew of 3 astronauts will stay in orbit for 6 months. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on our social media accounts. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.